interview all about the history of the North Shore and Lake Pontchartrain, which this interview occurs entirely during the Spanish period of occupation in southeast Louisiana. They had the land, both the North Shore and the South Shore, together right after the Revolutionary War from 1783 to 1810, a period of 30 years. And this is one of, so there's so many things that happened there that during this period for the history of the North Shore, and also for Jackson Square. Right now, Jackson Square is getting a lot of attention because the church is starting to fall apart. About 3 or 4 weeks ago, the local newspaper in New Orleans printed the front page. This is our most important building. And they said it needs repairs. This is what one of the individuals in our story today built St. Louis Cathedral after the Great Fire of 1788 and 1794 in New Orleans. And who is involved in? One of them that's leading the contributions to save the church, Gail Benson, the owner of the New Orleans Saints. So it's very important that we get the story in. I want to read something to you. We'll get into it. It's a very complicated history, but it's very important for both the North Shore and the South Shore. We have about 6 characters that make up the story. It's a controversy of Bayou Castan over legal ownership of land. Land was a driving force of the settlement of the North Shore and also Louisiana. Migrants coming over from Europe to the colonies, 13 colonies, wanted their own land. In Europe, they couldn't own the land. They worked for the nobles. And when they got over here, there was a strong desire to keep on moving west and settle into their own land. After the British left the area of Bayou Castan in 1781, that was the Revolutionary War, there were several major disputes occurred over the years from 1780 until 1834 when Bernard Maroney bought the land up and made Mandeville. The first major dispute, 2 disputes we're going to talk about. One is by one of the early settlers called Morgan Edwards. We're talking about the land dispute across the North Shore was called Pontchartrain Post during the Spanish period. And during the Spanish period of 1781, 83 to 1810, 30 years, it was all Spanish, both North Shore and South Shore. The British were gone. And a lot of the settlers after the war were coming in, the migration was started. But let me finish this. The first dispute over the land, the first majors involved Morgan Edwards, whose real name, we'll get into that, was not Morgan Edwards. He had 3 Spanish grants over on the North Shore. You'd have to look at the map, Tobin map. So his name was Morgan Edwards, and I believe he was the adopted son of the Baptist preacher who came over in 1761 from England and established the Baptist Church and wrote history of the Baptist religion. But anyway, in yellow on this picture here, Morgan Edwards had 3 land grants, and it totaled 1,900 acres. He got this from the Spanish governor, two of them, Esteban Miro, for participating in the Revolutionary War, helping Captain Pickles in the Battle of Lake Pontchartrain. And so he stayed down in New Orleans. Captain Pickles dropped off after the Battle of Lake Pontchartrain. There was still a little settlement on the North Shore for the British. And Captain Pickles dropped off some of his men to protect these people from Willing's raiders. The Smiths were still there, the Morris Smith and his wife, Mary Smith, and they had a daughter named Margaret. When he dropped off some of his men, one of them was Morgan Edwards. Morgan Edwards, they dropped them off in September, and Pickles came back in October the 16th with that oath of allegiance. In the meantime, Morgan Edwards met Margaret Smith, and he married her. They got married and they started living together. Right after the war was over, Morgan Edwards stayed there on the North Shore, and he had two pieces of property by Esteban Miro and another 100 acres pieces that he bought from Major Edwards right next to his mother-in-law, the Smiths, and that's on the Tobin map. The first evidence of a problem coming up was a Jacob Miller. Jacob Miller, being in the area, was listed as the witness of the wedding. He came in, they were Germans, and he came into his parents settled at Baton Rouge early in the 1760s. As he grew up, he got interested in brick making. And of course, after the big fire of 1788, as they passed the ordinance that New Orleans was mainly wood from the North Shore, the houses. Well, that caught fire and half of it burned down. So the new ordinance says you had to be made of brick. So Jacob Miller started looking for a place to have a brick made. He wound up on Bayou Castan, and he met the Jeffricons. And Abel Jeffricon was in early. He had a little spot that was on the map, pink, north of Morgan Edwards, 100 acres. But he had a daughter, he had a wife, Christina Weeks. Well, Abel died after a couple of years of settling on Bayou Castan, and here comes Jacob Miller. Jacob Miller took a shine to Christine Weeks, and later on they were married. But anyway, Jacob Miller decides this is a good place to set up a brickmaking thing. So he goes in 1795, after he marries Christina Weeks, and they have their little 100 acres right there on Bayou. He goes over to New Orleans, and it was a new mayor then, a new governor. It was at that time he went there, and he got he said, I wanted a land grant. He impressed the governor. He said, I want to make a brickmaking factory. Well, Coronellet was very gullible, and he made decisions quickly. But so he wrote a letter to Charles Parent, the commandant at Madisonville, saying, check it out. Is this land available? Well, something happened. Parent didn't check it out. And Governor Baron Coronellet issued 400-acre land grant to Jacob Miller. It happened to be, though, on Morgan Edwards' Spanish land grant. Now, the Spanish did things differently than the British in issuing land grants, and this is important to know. The British were very meticulous. They had 17 steps that you went through it, and one of them is the surveyor. They had an official surveyor. The Spanish didn't do that. They didn't have at the time, not until Charles Trudeau came in 1780. But what they did, was they issued it orally, and the governor wrote it down on paper in his book. It was written. And sometimes we would find out that it goes for years, these land grants, and they don't have a survey, though they still officially, legally own them under the Spanish, as long as the Spanish were there. Anyway, Jacob Miller goes over there, and he gets a land grant from Governor Cathedral for 400 acres, but it happened to be already taken, which the governor didn't know about, by Morgan Edwards. This was the first big dispute that lasted from 1796 to 1808, when Jacob Miller left and he went to Opelousas, where his family was. His father died up there, and he stayed there from 1808, and he died in 1834. So this is important to know. But anyway, when Morgan Edwards found out about this land grant and the activity going up, cleaning up the bayou, he made his own survey. Now, who was Morgan Edwards? Well, because it's a very unusual name. The only other Morgan Edwards we know that was in the United States at the time, though Louisiana had a lot of Edwardses in their political system. They still have one today, but they're not related. The Spanish had it all written down orally. So Morgan Edwards settled over there after Pickett let him down, set him over there to protect the settlers. But he started doing a little business himself with wood and bark and all that. Then he finds out that this man, Miller, comes over to take his land. So but what he did, he was very in tight with the Spanish officials in New Orleans. And the reason was that one of his best friends was Andre Alamaster y Rojas, the wealthiest man in New Orleans, a notary and the king's lieutenant, blah, blah, blah. So anyway, but he went early after he married Margaret Smith, and he found out the only way to get things done under Spanish law was to know somebody in the politics. And early he made friends with Rojas, Alamaster, and he had his children baptized in the Catholic Church in New Orleans. 3 of them, 2 girls and a boy. Now this was eye-opening because the priest was taking the information. He says, "My name is Morgan Edwards Hewitt. I'm not really was born with the name Morgan Edwards. I was born with the name Hewitt in Dublin, Ireland, and my parents are Bradley and Hewitt, John Hewitt." He's telling the people, I was not born. So it got me interested. If he wasn't Morgan Edwards, but he was actually a Hewitt, how did he get that name? So I went into, I have it in this book, The History of the Baptist Church, of Morgan Edwards, a Baptist preacher, and I followed him down. He, as a young man, became a Baptist minister. He was sent to Ireland, to Cork, and he spent 10 years. He married a woman there, and they started having children, but they all died, one after the other. 10 years later, he was sent to Dublin. His wife was getting to be a nervous wreck, a basket case. Dublin had a problem. They had a lot of orphans that were living in caves that the government was trying to subsidize and support. Anyway, Morgan Edwards the Baptist preacher had to do something drastic. He went and the order came for him to be transported back to England. So he went with his wife and he adopted one of the sons of the Hewitts, the Bradley Hewitt and his wife. He takes this Hewitt back to England with him. He was in England only for 1 year, and they order him to Philadelphia in 1761 to start the church in Philadelphia. He takes Hewitt with him. And this is how this Morgan Edwards Hewitt on the North Shore got his name. How he did, he came down with his friend, Philadelphia James Willing, when Willing made the raid right during the American Revolution, attacking the Loyalist thing. What is he going to do about Jacob Miller and the 400 acres that Carondelet issued to him? He goes to New Orleans, and his best friend was Alamaster, because Alamaster was a godchildren of two of his sons they had baptized. Alamaster at the time had promised the Cabildo, the council, that after the Great Fire he would rebuild the three most important buildings, the Cabildo, the St. Louis Church, and the Presbytère. He picked this noted engineer architect, Gilberto Guillemard. And Gilberto Guillemard started in 1795. He built the Cabildo. Then he built the St. Louis Cathedral, and he was working on the Presbytère. He had the first floor finished when Morgan Edwards comes over seeking help to make sure that Jacob Miller doesn't get his land for a brick factory. Alamaster tells his architect and builder, who was finished with the Cabildo and the St. Louis Cathedral in 1797, in December, he tells him to go with Morgan Edwards back over to Bayou Castan and make a survey, which he did. He get on a boat, they went over there, and for 3 weeks, this is the most important document here. Gilberto, it should be framed and should be on a wall because it has implications for several stories. But he has it in French. He surveyed, first of all, Morgan Edwards' land. He put in where Miller is. He put in where Zachariah Faircloth was, where Leah Sharp came in there. But this is what he surveyed. Now, Smith said, "Oh, while you over here, survey mine." Spells said, "Oh, while you over here, survey mine too." In the meantime, about 5 or 6 years before, James Goodby married Sarah Westcott, and he came over with his sister, Elizabeth Goodby, and they settled in this land here. He said, "Survey my land too." And he did. And you can see where he put the house, the roads going to Madisonville and Covington. Continuing, Gilberto Guillemard is going to be a very important person during the Spanish period, both in New Orleans and also on the North Shore Pontchartrain Post. This map is going to be, actually, it solved Morgan Edwards' problem. It definitely shows that this is all vacant land and that Elizabeth Goodby did not own it. Later, 25 years later, in a court case called Letchworth and Wife versus Bartle and Wife. That's a very important court case. So this map is important not only for Morgan Edwards, but it's also important for this court case that happened 25 years later. All right. Now, I wanted to say about Morgan Edwards. I believe that he was the son of the Baptist preacher, and he came down with Willing, and he fought with Pickles in a battle. You can decide for yourself. I have the oath of allegiance that William Pickles had these settlers signed on October the 16th, 1779. I believe it was written by Morgan Edwards that Pickles put on there a month before. Morgan Edwards was very well educated because of his stepfather, his father. Morgan Edwards, the Baptist preacher, believed in a good education for children. And I believe that's what he did in Philadelphia. And while Morgan Edwards was going to school and learning, he met James Willing. And that's how they became friends, and he came down. Anyway, you can be the judge. Look at this oath of allegiance. Look at the writings of Morgan Edwards, and what do you believe? Especially the dates. And also the way he put some of these words down. I wish this was more clearer, but it's the best I can do. Now, but what happens right after this survey was made? Catastrophe. Alamaster died a few months later in 1798, a few months after this was done. Morgan Edwards dies a couple of months later after that. Both of them died in 1798, right after this was finished. On top of it, Jacob Miller still was pushing his claim. Coronellet, was transferred right after this happened to Central America, so he couldn't change it. And the new governor after that, Lemoyne, was so busy for a couple of years, he died 2 years later. So nothing was ever done to say to Jacob Miller, no, you don't own the land, because Morgan Edwards was dead and he wasn't pushing it. Alamaster was dead. But what happened to Guillemard? Alamaster's wife, her daughter Michaela, married a Pontabla, Baron Pontabla's son. But anyway, she says, look, my husband's dead. I'm not putting any more money in you building these buildings in Jackson Square. The council said, oh, wait a minute, we don't have money to end. Your husband promised to do it. He put it in writing. The king was to give him. So anyway, for 2 years, that stood from 1798 to 1801, nothing was done on the Presbytère. Gilberto Guillemard stopped working. He wasn't getting paid. The King of Spain, Carlos IV, after 2 years, he steps in and says, the wife to Alamaster, you don't have to pay it. You're off the hook. Guillemard says, well, who's going to pay me? The council gave him a little money, but he didn't get his salary. He stuck around in New Orleans with the intendant until 1805. And then, when Governor Claiborne told the Spanish to get out, he went with Intendant Morales to Pensacola, and he was settling there in 1805. He was only in Pensacola for 2 or 3 years, and he died. But he was in financial difficulty. He still wanted his money. But he never did get it. So I tried to contact Pensacola and ask him about where Gilberto Guillemard was buried. They said, well, what are you talking about? I said, this guy is the most important, one of the most important historical persons that are involved with Jackson Square, and also this land problem on Pontchartrain Post. So I let it go at that. That was a couple of years ago. Then the newspaper comes out with this article that they want to start collecting money to save the St. Louis Cathedral. So Guillemard applied, and those, first of all, he took surveying jobs. He took 3 surveying jobs. And they stayed in Pensacola. He tried to get appointed to a job in Texas that was just forming in Texas there, the Spanish Texas. But that was turned down. And then he died. I tried to contact city officials and the cemeteries. They didn't know nothing about. How do I know that he would die and he was buried over there? Several reasons. And some of them in the book here. This is in the second book. One, the sacramental records of the church in New Orleans received notice that he died in Pensacola in 1808, and it's in their sacramental records book. It's noticed there. Gilberto Guillemard dies in Pensacola. The second thing is that the wife did not leave Pensacola. I have letters of it. She was there 10 years later in 1816, 8 years later. And she was applying for a passport to come to New Orleans. And also, her brother, like I said, she is a Bizador. Her father was one of the famous surgeons of New Orleans. They were from Mobile. I think he married a Deucin, D-O-C-C-I-N. And they had 12 kids. So this is important. She was still there 8 years later in these letters. And she was trying to get the governor of Louisiana to approve. She contacted over in Pensacola the head surveyor, Vincent Potato, and she asked him but the problem was, remember what I told you about the Spanish and their land grants? There was no survey. She said he was given 100, my father, Bizador, Louis Barbeau Bizador, the surgeon, was given 100,000 acres and that on the east side of the Pearl River. They said, well, where's the survey? She says, so she contacted Vincent Potato in Pensacola, who contacted Jacques Lorraines in Madisonville. Jacques Lorraines was a surveyor. He learned it like they all did. They worked for a surveyor. But Jacques Lorraine wrote the letter back and saying, look, it's July. I'm not going down and over there on Pearl River with the mosquitoes and the bug. I'll do that. This was in 1810, the letter. I'll do it in December. Well, lo and behold, the uprising occurred. And so that's where it died. But anyway, to show you that Gilberto Guillemard, the one who built the Cabildo, the Presbytère, the first floor of the Presbytère, and St. Louis Cathedral, one of the most important historic individuals for New Orleans. They have nothing on. And when I asked people, they shrugged their shoulders. Well, recently I contacted them again, and now they're more interested. I suggested other ways that they could find out, because Guillemard certainly is important, not only in the history of the North Shore Pontchartrain Post with this survey, but he was the aide major, the highest military officer, lieutenant colonel, and so forth. So that's the point I have. Now, going back to show you, I told you about Morgan Edwards. Here is the baptismal records showing that Morgan Edwards baptized his children in New Orleans and was a friend of Alamet. And here is the records in the St. Louis baptismal thing stating where Morgan Edwards Hewitt Smith, he married Margaret Smith, had his children. So I believe if you check the handwriting, and also if you look at the documents that we have, I think you will maybe come to the same conclusion I came to, that Morgan Edwards Hewitt was adopted. What else why would somebody take a strange name if it wasn't for that? And everything fitted, checking out Morgan Edwards, the Baptist preacher. Now, that's all. We have a lot of pictures, and his Alamaster, he died in 1798. He's the one that financed Morgan Edwards. On the back cover of volume 6 this is a picture of the Baptist preacher that I believe Morgan Edwards was adopted by. Continuing with Gilberto Guillemard, I said here I made a hand tree, genealogical tree, of who he married. He married the daughter of the surgeon of New Orleans, Barbeau Bizador. They had, him and his wife had 12 kids. This woman, his wife, Maria Felicia, these are the letters. I have 3 or 4 letters from Maria Felicia trying to get the land grant that her father was given by the Spanish, 100,000 acres. Of course, it was denied when they didn't have a survey for it, and a lot of people were using fraud at the time. They were claiming this and that, but Congress in its wisdom said that you had to be living on the land and you had to have proof, not just, and it went, some of the people like the Cousin died in 1819. He tried to claim Governor Pierre Rigaud Vaudreuil's 4,800 acres on the Tobin map, which Vaudreuil gave to himself in 1743 to start an indigo plantation. That was one of the biggest things on the North Shore, to start that early. He spent 10 years in Louisiana, Canadian. He was a Canadian, the son of the governor of Canada. He became governor of Canada too. But he spent 10 years, and then when he was leaving, he gave this 4,800 acres to his wife's granddaughter, Marie Joseph Samanard, who was the wife of Pierre Michael Hertel Rouville. And anyway, later on, after Rouville came back from Canada in the Revolutionary War, he died in New Orleans in 1774. That was the year that Rumsey started his experiments on Bayou Rouville across the lake. She then sold that 4,800 acres to Rumsey at the end of in February of 1776. But Rumsey, after a year and a half of working with his experiments, a man named Cousin, Francois Cousin, came in and got a grant right north of it by Rouville, and he started a brick making and wood factory. and he had 6 ships. And these ships would go back and forth right where Rumsey was experimenting. Rumsey was paranoid about secrecy. So he contacts his old friend, his client, Marie Joseph Tesruso, who owned Pearl Island, and he moves over to Pearl Island. So that's interesting. Anyway, getting back to Guillemard's map, not only was it important in a trial 25 years later, when Elizabeth Goodby tried to finesse this vacant land down there, but this map, the jury, it didn't take them long to say, no, you didn't. And she admitted later that she had forged letters and things like that. So, but anyway, one of the interesting things about the map is James Goodby comes in with his sister in 1790 from Galveston across the lake, and he settles there. That was the first that the Goodbys first got to the North Shore. Elizabeth Goodby, his younger sister, played a very, very important role in the history of the North Shore in Mandeville. She, as a young girl, she was probably about 18, and she marries Thomas Spell, who was down here. Thomas Spell was about, anyway, she marries him, but her brother has a little road passing his house. He starts a cemetery. 2 of his children died in 1795. It is probably the 3rd most important cemetery in southeastern Louisiana. Number 1 is St. Louis number 1, who started in 1769. Number 2 was the cemetery at Madisonville that started in 1795 when Charles Perrant's son, Joseph Urson, died and was buried under that big. This was the 3rd cemetery on the north. The road went by, and it became, today is the Thomas Spell Memorial Cemetery. It went through several names. Sharp Spell Strain Cemetery, Thomas Spell Cemetery. Now, Thomas Memorial Cemetery, dedicated about 10 years ago. That's the name of it. Who's buried there, and why is it important? Well, looking in the book here, when I first started this surveying, I met a man called Edgar Sharp. And Edgar Sharp took an interest in the cemetery. He's got several pictures here. And that's all about the cemetery. Edgar Sharp was taking care of the cemetery and the people there. When I started doing this research on the Sharps and Spells, I met Edgar, and he advised me in many ways and told me many stories that I put on tape. In my collection in Southeastern, I have 100 voice tapes of these people telling me about the history of it. But anyway, Edgar Sharp played an important role. I was thinking, this cemetery is right where the mayor's office in the of Mandeville and the clerk of court and so forth is right in the same area. I was thinking that a map, this should be in a frame, and a map could be put on the wall, the prehistory of Mandeville. This was 40 years before deMarigny, after this court case. The court case was very important with Elizabeth Spell because it sort of broke up the community and people started selling their land. deMarigny at the time just bought the big piece from the Bonneville, and in 1829, and I think he was trying to repeat his success and what he did in New Orleans on Faubourg Marigny. So he started buying up from the Edwards, the descendants of Morgan Edwards, their property first, and then the Smiths, and then the Faircloths. So the cemetery is sort of connected to all of the history of the North Shore Pontchartrain Post. We have all the people that's buried in the cemetery, the history of it here. There is a picture of Edgar Sharp. He put a fence around it. This cemetery was started by James Goodby in 1795, and this is why. So Edgar died in 1994 or something, and he's buried in that cemetery. I think a map on City Hall should be on a wall, and it could be dedicated to people like Edgar Sharp, who took care of a very historic cemetery in Mandeville. I'm hoping the Spanish, of course, with the revolt of 1810, lost their property on the North Shore. It became American property. Governor Claiborne raised the flag December the 10th, 1810 in Baton Rouge. Horsemen from Baton Rouge came down, swept through, and took over. The Spanish couldn't do anything about it. Later on, things were worked out, and I think the United States paid the Spanish for some of the property. But all this is tied together. We started with Morgan Edwards and Jacob Miller having problems with their land titles. And we went to another problem of a court case with land. Gilberto Guillemard, the surveyor, builder, and architect, was called over and made a map of it. I'd like to add something to this. Everyone does not agree with my research. I put in here 2 pieces of research material that disagree, and I want you to know about them. One is a book called Sunshine and Shadows, a history of the Goodby and Edwards family in southeast Louisiana. They don't believe that Morgan Edwards was adopted by the Baptist preacher. They believe, like somebody started a rumor years ago, that he was a pirate. They didn't mean he was a pirate. They meant, and they didn't say it, that he was with James Willing, who on his raid that came down in February of 17 and destroyed a lot of plantations. And they were still angry over it and everything. But yeah, this is very interesting, and these are the people that made the book. They didn't agree with me, but what they agreed with, I'm flabbergasted that would believe rumors that have no documentation to it. I have documentation showing that Morgan Edwards baptized these kids, that the Baptist preacher was there where he was born, you know, at a meeting, and his wife was having physical problems. They were married 10 years and she had 4 abortions, 4 deaths of children being born. The other one is from a famous author in California named Howard Stewart. And they wrote to him, these people from Sunshine, saying, this Donald Sharp did a research on the Baptist preacher, and he says that Morgan Edwards was adopted. And this guy says, I wrote a book on, he wrote the book on Morgan Edwards. And I never did see any statement that Morgan Edwards said he probably at that time it was maybe a stigma that they didn't want people to know that his wife had all these, I don't know. But he says, tell Donald Sharp he's searching in the wrong direction. So here's two people, both of them authors, and how distortions get made in history that you have to be very careful of which you should see. My co-author of our book, I would strongly suggest that you get a copy of our book, Anita Campo and Donald Sharp. A lot of what I was telling you about Gilberto Guillemard and his court case 225 is in this book, and it will all pan out. But my co-author, Anita Campo, to me, she was a genius, and you'd see that in her writing. She told me several times over, Donald, never put something down that you don't have a document for. There's too much of fraud and distortion in history. With Rumsey, it was not only a distortion, it was hidden history. 37 years of hidden history on the North Shore. But thank you for watching this video. Have a good day.